Proverbs chapter 4. So chapters 5 and onward get very specific, talking about specific issues of how wisdom is gained in specific circumstances. Most of Proverbs chapter 4 still falls under kind of the general instruction of the way to wisdom. He does a lot of introductory stuff in the first 3 chapters. And so as I'm reading through this, I'm like, well, some of the stuff we've already talked about because it's more generalities in regards to how to gain wisdom or what wisdom does for one, things along those lines. But he does get specific with a couple things. So I'm going to focus mainly on just 2 or 3 verses that are more about specific topics in regards to this, again, overall theme of wisdom. So we're going to actually read through the first 16 verses before we get to more of a specific circumstance. Verse 1, listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so you do not forsake my teaching. For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart, keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown. So it's, metaphorical language, kind of flowery in nature, but still more general in regards to the importance of wisdom. Verse 10, listen, my son, accept what I say, and the years of your life will be many. I instruct you in the way of wisdom and lead you along straight paths. When you walk, your steps will not be hampered. When you run, you will not stumble. Hold on to instruction. Do not let it go. Guard it well, for it is your life. Do not set foot on the path of the wicked or walk in the way of evildoers. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn from it and go on your own way. And then verse 16 is kind of where we'll start with some additional teaching. For they cannot rest. These are talking about the wicked or evildoers that he mentions in verse 14. For they cannot rest until they do evil. They are robbed of sleep till they make someone stumble. Years ago, I went on a mission trip to Jamaica, and we were helping to finish both a church, and right behind the church there was a small building that was going to be a medical center, and we were basically pouring concrete and just helping build a wall or a roof or what have you. And of course, you have a number of Americans who are in downtown Montego Bay working on this church structure and medical facility, and it attracts attention. So all the neighbors were kind of watching us and coming around. We had to dodge a rock fight one afternoon when 2 ladies got upset with each other for some reason, and right in the alley they started throwing rocks at each other, so we're all diving for cover. But during the course of one of the days, a guy pulls up, and he's an American, and pulls up on a motorcycle and gets off the motorcycle. He just stands there. He's probably about 30, 40 yards away, and he's just watching us. And so I thought, well, go over and say hi to him. So I go over and I struck up a conversation with him, and there was something that wasn't quite right about him, and I couldn't figure out what it was, but I almost felt like in his countenance, and I have had more of this as I've gotten older, is seeing people that you're interacting with, or even sometimes in the store passing by a person, and noticing that their countenance is off. And you can't necessarily point to anything in particular, but you just think to yourself, okay, one option is maybe this person has had a hard life, or they're just having a really bad day and it's showing in their face. But the other one is this idea of this phrase, for they cannot rest until they do evil. They are robbed of sleep till they make someone stumble. And so one of the suggestions here is that the evil doer in in their countenance will almost look like sleeplessness. You know, the kind of things where, you know, the bags under your eyes, things are just not looking good, and the countenance changes. And I actually totally agree with that, that there are scenarios where you see that people, because they have chosen a very evil lifestyle, their facial expression, their countenance, the way they carry themselves, and this is what I felt from this person. And I'm like, you know, and I told him we were from a church in America, that we were helping, and, you know, we had this conversation, and he responded somewhat in the positive, but I also know he was kind of there to basically watch us. And so I walked away, and one of the locals came up to me and asked me about the conversation. I told him was what we were talking about, and he goes, "You knew who that was, don't you?" I said, I don't know Jamaica well enough to know just by looking at somebody. He said he's the local drug dealer. Then he's checking you guys out to make sure you're not, you know, getting in on his territory. Yeah. I said, well, I'm probably not getting in on his territory, I can tell you that. And so, you know, the idea of the countenance changes, and the idea of the foolish when they turn to evil. Verse 16 also suggests that they get so hyper-focused on wanting to do evil, and this is really, really sad, that they lay in bed at night and they can't sleep, because basically what Solomon is saying is all they're thinking about is who they can injure next, what evil they can perform next. And that's sad to think about, that there's people out there they stay up late at night just figuring out how to hurt people, figuring out how to do evil. That's kind of what the suggestion is there, and it's going to show almost like as a sleeplessness on their countenance. He goes on, and it makes a very interesting statement in verse 17, kind of continuing this idea of what happens to those who choose evil. Very simple statement. It says, they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. And when I saw this phrase, I thought, well, that's really an interesting phrase, because there's almost a reverse prophecy there. And what I mean by that is that Solomon is suggesting that even though, or basically Scripture is suggesting that even though Solomon had no idea of what the upper room experience was like, he had no concept of the bread and the wine of communion, that he actually uses the exact same items that were instituted as the Lord's Supper for what we do as communion. And it's almost, that's why I say it's like an inverted communion. It's like these people are taking communion, but it's so that they can do evil. You know, they're eating the bread, they're drinking the wine, but they're doing the opposite of what the outcome of communion is supposed to do for us. And I thought that was an interesting. I don't know if Scripture, if God meant to do that in stating it, having Solomon state it that way, but I think, yeah, he probably did. He probably was saying, like basically that the wicked have their own communion, and was almost suggesting way before there was actually the upper room and communion, the Lord's Supper was established. It's there in an inverted way as well. Verse 18, the path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. But the way of wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. And of course, that's very indicative of, you know, the metaphor in Scripture over and over again, that light represents God, darkness represents Satan, darkness represents evil, light represents good. Verse 20, my son, pay attention to what I say. Turn your ears to my words. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to one's whole body. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And this is next verse 24. We're going to camp out on for a little while, because it is more specific. It says, keep your mouth free of perversity. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. There's two words there. And they to some degree, one is an introductory word, and then one is a deeper word that has similar meaning, but it's much deeper. So, keep your mouth free of perversity. When you look at perversity, in some Bibles it's translated as deceitful. It's a word that generally in the Hebrew is focused on the idea of what the Bible calls the lying tongue. The person who is not truthful. So it's kind of a simplistic term for the person who chooses untruthfulness, chooses lying, that word perversity. But then it says, keep corrupt talk far from your lips. And the corrupt talk actually has a deeper meaning. And I want to kind of discuss, and we will have during our discussion time, this idea of what does corrupt talk look like. And one of the suggestions that I looked at is that the idea of corrupt talk in the Hebrew focuses on the distortion of words, the distortion of meanings of words. And basically another way to put it that we often hear today is the deconstruction of language, using words in a way that they're not supposed to be used for. And there's several things about that one that I'll suggest. So part of it is this keeping or corrupt talk far from your lips. It's more than just lying. It's changing the meaning of words. It's distorting someone else's words or redefining what you say, trying to make it mean something else. This is what you said. Maybe somebody said something to you and you disagree with it, and you say, well, this is what you said. And you might even repeat it word for word, and they say, well, that's not what I meant. So wait a second, that's what you said, and so it's kind of changing the meaning of words, sometimes in midstream. Here's an example of how distorting or corrupt talk distorts. So a parent who sees a bunch of cookies gone from the cookie jar. And the parent sees the child, there's crumbs all over his face kind of deal. And the parent says, did you eat cookies out of the cookie jar? And the child doesn't think they're lying because this is their reply. I didn't take any cookies from the cookie jar. And the reason is because his brother took the cookies from the cookie jar and then both of them ate them. So what he's doing is he's trying to twist what the conversation is, which is basically the sin nature, and we're all guilty of it at times, and we learn it in fact, we don't even have to learn it because the child, once they realize they're in trouble, is quite intelligent to be able to decide, well, what I have to do here is figure out how to twist my words to try to get out of it. So it's not, when the parent asks, did you eat cookies out of the cookie jar, it's not, yes, I did. It's, I didn't take any cookies out of the cookie jar. It's a twisting of the conversation to bring it into the favor of the child. That's what the sin nature does, and that's what people honestly are great at. A couple other things I'll mention about this idea of distorting meaning in communication. Selective information in communication. So the idea is, when the Bible talks about how we communicate with people, it says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, be clear in what you say. And so distorting words in this idea of what Solomon is suggesting is that when you leave out certain information. So, and I'll give you a simple example. When I sell furniture to people, and they'll ask me about a piece, I'll say, great piece, beautiful, look at this back corner, there's a chip on this back corner. So the issue is a selective communication is, great piece, you want to buy it. Mm-hmm. And they can figure out on their own if there's a chip on the back. And the issue is selective communication is not honest communication. Mm-hmm. And that the whole idea again of yes be yes and no be no, speak truthfully about things. The other one is emotional manipulation in language. And one of the biggest ones, and this is actually one I've seen in the church that I highly disagree with, is using your speech as a guilt trip. And we'll spend some time on this one during discussion, because all of us probably have had circumstances where either in our family, with friends, with enemies, with associates, in people in business, is the idea of using guilt as a motivator. And I have said time and again as a pastor, when I have to do things like, hey, we need help with, the nursery, or we need help here, or we need, this sort of thing, I've always tried to say, listen, I don't communicate in such a way that you should be motivated by guilt. And what I say to them is, guilt is a good short-term motivator. But there's some things that happen in guilt motivation inside of our emotions when somebody attempts to guilt motivate us. We can handle it a little bit, because in some cases, okay, I'm going to be Christ-like in this experience, and this person is guilting me, but I do want to help them, and I do want to care for them. But if it becomes a regular thing that people are motivating others through guilt, there becomes an emotional reaction from the other person, and that's anger or bitterness or mistrust. And so when we use language as a weapon, as kind of Solomon is suggesting, one of the things is motivating by guilt. Another one is, and we've probably experienced this with people at times, is fake emergencies, where they communicate a need to us, and you communicate it in a larger way than it really is. And again, that's kind of hoping that they'll feel sorry for you and help you. There's actually, again, here's my weekly Lord of the Rings illustration. One of the characters in the Lord of the Rings that has a real problem with how they communicate, the name of the character is Worm Tongue. And basically he's a whisperer into King Theoden's ear, and what he does is anyone he doesn't like, he whispers into the ear of the king to basically try to convince him to not like that person and not follow that person's advice either. Anyone he likes, he ingratiates himself to, because he's going to get something out of it. And so Tolkien called him Worm Tongue because he used his words as a weapon. And he gets his comeuppance in the story as a result of doing that. So there's a couple others even here that we may talk about during discussion time, but there's a number of things to think about when it comes to how we use our words, the emotional and intellectual impact they have on people, and that corrupt talk. I mean, sometimes when we read a verse like that, corrupt talk, we just think of someone talking meanly to somebody else. And there's a much deeper list of how we use our language as a weapon within the sin nature, and how the flesh uses language to get its way to accomplish the things that it wants to accomplish that are of sinfulness and not a reaction of goodness in our lives. Last few verses 25 through 27. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Do not turn to the right or the left. Keep your foot from evil. So there again, the metaphor is keep your focus on the goal of godliness, the goal of wisdom. Stay on that path. Don't turn from it, is how this particular chapter 4 ends. So let's take a break, and then we will have some discussion on some of those topics.
We'll be back in about 2 minutes.
cake too.
All right, so we had a question that popped up during discussion that'll kind of springboard us into our discussion, and it's related to a particular phrase. What's the verse?
Verse 7, the second half of verse 7 says, though it cost all you have, get understanding. My question was, what does that actually mean? That's going to cost all I have.
Yeah. So one of the illustrations I thought of immediately was I had a friend when I was pastoring downstate who was in a very high tense sales world in the automotive world in the Detroit area. And he was selling product all over the world for the things that they made. And he was regularly asked by the company to misrepresent what he was selling in different ways. So he was, in effect, professionally lying to customers about different things, and it was because his superiors wanted him to. And he just, as a young man, he got involved in that particular profession, and he just kind of, his comment to me was, everybody does that. I just thought that's just the way you do things. Well, now he's starting to have a conscience about this. Yeah. And honestly, he's starting to move toward the way of wisdom rather than foolishness. But the real concern was, and he talked to me about it, he said, if I refuse to do this, I could lose my job. Mm-hmm. And that, it's not your whole life over, but it's a huge deal. And what do you do in that? And he actually ended up changing jobs and going to another company. And so he's able to kind of live out for not a real long period of time, but he realized, I need to get out of this place because if I'm going to be honest, I'm probably going to get fired. And so there is a cost to choosing wisdom. There's a cost to choosing understanding. There's a cost to following the straight path of goodness. Some of us, it'll be small. We may choose to speak the truth to someone in our family and they're upset with us about it. And we kind of have to juggle that relationship. In other cases, the cost may be huge. And especially when you talk about people who are persecuted and martyred for their faith, which certainly was coming in the New Testament time, then choosing wisdom could mean off with your head kind of stuff. So that's Solomon's kind of saying it can cost a lot to choose the way of wisdom.
Okay.
What do you think about what I shared about the idea of the physical countenance changing when it comes to evil? That sometimes you can look at someone and you kind of can't, you can't say, oh, guaranteed I know that there's something evil about this person, but there's some sense that you get. What do you think about that?
I think people that, in the same respect, when you come into a room or a situation and there's somebody that you get a good vibe from, I think you can get a bad vibe, and I'm sure we've all had situations where you've met somebody and it's like you just have this, and even some situations where you can even get this like overwhelmingly evil feeling from somebody. So no, I think that because their life, they live it in this situation or your example in an evil or a non-honest, whatever you want to put there, it kind of radiates from them, and in their aura, their personality, whatever, that's what, if you're in tune, you pick up on that.
I think that's actually one thing, and there's many layers of this, but that's one thing that occurs with the verse that says spirit speaks to spirit. Is there are times when you meet somebody and your immediate thought is, oh, this person must be a believer in Christ. There's just so much joy, and there's just see it on them. And then there's other people that your spirit just says there's just something that's not right here. I've had the experience on a few occasions where I've explained being in the person's presence this way. They walked in the room and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. That there's just a coldness to their personality. And one of of the funny things, actually, I guess it's not funny, but one of the interesting things about it is on a few of those occasions, I have known somebody who's maybe my age when I was 30 or my age when I was 40 or something like that. And the way I experienced that 20-degree drop was I met their parents, or I met a parent. And I'm just thinking, okay, I've been concerned about the spiritual and emotional well-being of this person that I know. I just met their parent, and now I know why. It's like that. There's this coldness that says, this person that I know, why are they acting the way they do? And when I meet the parent, I say, oh, it's shame, it's guilt, it's been poured upon by the parent who is cold and unfeeling and shames and guilts the child, who's now an adult that I know. Other thoughts about that idea of evil producing a change in physical countenance?
I think you do need to use discernment in those situations, like you did when you were in Jamaica. And I've come across people like that where in the past, when I was younger, I tried to avoid interacting because I had a bad feeling about them.
Right about them.
And, fear is creeping in. And now as I get older, I'm trying to start a conversation with them so that I actually find out a little more about them. And, probably half the time, the person turns out to be just fine, in our interaction. And then half the time I still feel like I'm not gonna interact with this person anymore. So.
Yeah. And there is a safety mechanism that needs, like, so for instance, for somebody who's physically able to take care of themselves, if it's a young 20-year-old girl talking to a 55-year-old man and they get a negative vibe, then you end that conversation and move on. Yeah. If you're 55-year-old gentleman and you're talking to a 55-year-old gentleman that you feel something different, then yeah, you could probably begin to move a little into that conversation. So you have to be wise in when is it appropriate to move in that direction, when is it not. Other thoughts?
Well, you talk about the temperature of the room or the presence. I've actually experienced where in the church in Montana, someone would come only once in a while, but when they came, everything changed in the room. And often I would be in front of where they would sit, and I didn't even have to look around, but I knew when they entered the room because everything changed. And everybody goes on high alert that's aware of that kind of a situation, and yet you don't turn around and look at them, you know they're in the room. And it's just, it's that spirit letting you know.
Yeah, spirit speaks to spirit, because I do believe there are some where you just kind of get that spiritual understanding that this person is not in a good place. Now, sometimes you can feel compassion for them because you feel a brokenness. Other times you just feel evil.
Oh no, it was evil. Yeah.
I still have no clue because it was an older gentleman, and I didn't necessarily always trust everything he said, but he said something to me that was very intriguing at one point in time. He studied art in his lifetime, and some of you guys know who I'm talking about. And he once told me that he could tell by someone's art if a person had murdered somebody, which I thought was really intriguing. Is like then it would come out, that guilt and that frame of mind and spirit would come out in their art. Guilt as a motivator. We talked about that for a little while. How do we recognize that we are being motivated by guilt? It gets easier as you get older to recognize that sort of thing. But how do you come to a conclusion that it's like, okay, they're kind of pouring it on with guilt, and now I have to begin to figure out how am I going to create an appropriate environment and not let that guilt, because some people have been motivated by guilt their whole lives. And And so when they are guilted, they immediately respond and try to do something. They do not have appropriate boundaries when it comes to guilt, and usually it's because they have been guilted a lot over the course of their life, and they haven't been able to come to a point where they're spiritually and emotionally healthy enough to build proper boundaries. And boundaries may be something we talk about during this conversation. But let's start this way. How do we recognize that somebody's using guilt as a motivator?
Well, they continually ask you the same thing over and over again. You know, if you say no, then they keep asking you.
They make you feel worse every ask.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I used to say yes all the time.
Mm.
I'm getting wiser as I get older. And like a friend of mine, this is 15 years ago when Facebook started, I had a bunch of friends. I was a college roommate, contacted me, and we conversed for a couple weeks. And then I didn't get back with him in his time frame. And then he wrote me and said, "So are you too good for me?"
Ah, there you go.
It was, you know, and I said,
Wow.
so I guess I was. I stopped Facebook at that point. I just shut it off for everybody because I said I'm not going to do this with people.
Just don't, yeah.
So that was a long time ago, but that's kind of a drastic reaction. but I'm glad I did because I don't have to deal with it. I think there's, especially online, there's a lot of guilt.
Oh, absolutely.
It's really bad on Facebook.
Yeah. The issue.
Social media.
The issue is, you know, you will say things that online, you'll type things that you would never say something, you know, face to a person.
Yeah.
But I mean, honestly, I think one of the things that social media has been great for is to help people realize that yes, everybody has a sin nature.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious when
Right.
people can do whatever they want. You know, it's kind of like the same thing they talk about people in cars. You know, when you're in a car, nobody knows who you are, and so you see people acting crazy in cars because there's no accountability. As soon as you stop the accountability, you find out how bad the sin nature is in people's lives.
Like the 74-year-old hitting the 70-year-old with an axe
Yeah.
because he didn't turn at the light.
Here in Traverse City, it happens just like everybody everywhere else.
Yeah.
I had an experience actually fairly early on in ministry, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I'm very uncomfortable with pastors using, or anybody using guilt as a motivator, but in the church I've seen it. I went to a family camp one time, and the worship leader got up and he led a song, and then when the song was over, he was very unhappy because people must not have sang enough, been into enough, and he browbeat the entire congregation for like 5 minutes about how folks need to get excited, you know, and you need to sing, and and then he did another song, and at the end of the next song, he did the same thing. He browbeat people, and I'm standing there and I'm looking around, and you can tell how uncomfortable everybody's becoming, and how some of the people, and I'm one of them, at that point say, "Well, I'm not singing at all now." I mean, I'm a disagreeable person. The agreeable people are like, "Oh, I guess we better sing louder." The disagreeable people want to get up and walk out, you know? And it's like, yeah, that's not really, if you want people to engage in worship, teach them how to worship. Don't guilt them and browbeat them and expect that you're going to get a great, long-term reaction.
Yeah.
The agreeable people will react immediately and try to do better. The disagreeable people just won't come back if you lead worship that way. So if we're older in the faith and we have more years of wisdom behind us, how do we help people who have gotten used to guilt being a central motivator to their life? Either the people who use guilt as a motivator, if they come to Christ and they're in the faith and they're trying to grow, but they've grown up maybe with a family that's used guilt as a motivator their whole life, and that's just what they're used to. That takes some unlearning. And how do we help people recognize when they're being motivated by guilt and potentially put up proper boundaries? How do we help and not hinder the idea of guilt as a motivator?
I think there's a, that's one of those, I think, where it's relationally based, it's opportunity, that if it's something where, I'm just using us as an example. I've known you for years, and where you could come up to me, or I could come up to you and say, you know what, Matt, this, that, and the other thing. You're guilting Debbie into whatever.
Physician, heal thyself.
But if it's a situation where where you don't know somebody, or maybe somebody's just having a bad day, or both situationally and opportunity wise, I think there's a lot of factors that are involved with approaching somebody, but I think, quite honestly, if those factors are in line, honesty is I think honesty is the best policy. It's like, hey, I'm coming to you with this because this is what I see, and I think it's hindering your walk,
So relationship is the first. Why does God say, love him and love our neighbor? Because it's very difficult to help somebody be trained up in righteousness unless we have a relationship of love with them, because they're not going to trust us otherwise. And we're dealing with some of the nitty gritty that can be very difficult, because you may build a relationship with somebody and let's say you decide you're going to speak to them about motivating by guilt, and what you have to recognize is it's possible that you may be the first person to ever bring it up to them.
right.
That's just been their whole experience. Maybe because of their family, because of their background, they're just used to something, and that can be in any area, not just motivating by guilt. That can be lots of things where suddenly it's a surprise to them because they've never been approached with something like that. So the relational aspect becomes so important, and also then you have to make a commitment to them as a person. Because it's not like, well, I'm going to tell you that you motivate by guilt and then disappear. It's the issue is how are you going to help that person walk that journey? And it's and the I think the Holy Spirit will show you how to walk that journey with a person. And if they're open and realize, well, wow, maybe I do this. Somebody has brought it up to me. How can I heal from this sort of thing? Other thoughts about how we help people who potentially motivate by guilt?
I think it's important to check your own motive.
Okay.
For confrontation or carefrontation, you need to make sure your motive is in the right place.
Right.
And then that person may be hurt by your confrontation, but if you do it in a proper way, in a humble way, hopefully the relationship can be maintained and move forward in a healthy manner.
So, and one of those things means that if you're going to do that, we use that term boundaries, is you have to set those boundaries. And in fact, if you put yourself in that person's orbit, like let's say you notice this and you have a friendship that's beginning with someone, then what you really need to do is if you're going to eventually speak to it, or you're going to eventually try to help them grow out of it, you have to make a commitment to that person, which also means that you may be guilted. You may actually be one of the persons you may end up being a victim of that. Whereas you could say, well, this person motivates by guilt, I'm just going to stay away from them because I don't want to be motivated by guilt in their life. You may say, I care about them so much, I'm going to stay in their orbit, and wait for them to motivate me by guilt and then say, well, now I have an example that I can sit down with the person and talk about. So and that's difficult because you're putting yourself in a sacrificial position, which isn't that just like what Christ did. And this is the thing I think we don't understand sometimes about how we walk with other people, is there are times when you see a weakness in a person, and rather than just staying away from that, or you hear that, and maybe they say something, they motivate by guilt, and you're like, okay, I'm going to make an excuse to get out of here. And maybe the next time, motivate by guilt, I'm going to make an excuse to get out of here. You may have to decide, you know what, I'm going to stay in this position. And I'm going to sacrificially work with this person, even though they're currently motivating me by guilt, so that I can eventually have that conversation that needs to happen, and I can say, this is what I felt, this is what I experienced as you motivated me by guilt. And it's because it's one thing to say something to somebody, you may motivate by guilt. Well, what does that mean? It's another thing to say, I experienced it with you as I sought to build a friendship with you, and now I can speak to it. And that is, like I said, that's a sacrificial stance. That's actually staying in the situation so that, not so that you can be constantly motivated by guilt, so that you can speak to the issue well.
So that's also using I statements and not you, which tends to put a dividing wall there. I feel.
Right.
So that helps, that helps with easing that blow.
Yeah.
Well, people don't get on the defensive.
As quickly, yeah. So.
And it's hard, it's not easy to communicate with somebody when you're suggesting to them that they have some sort of fault in their life that you're trying to help them overcome. You need, like I said, you need to stay in that relationship long enough to win the right to be heard, and then when you do speak, you've got to be able to speak with a lot of Solomon's wisdom. All right, so that's chapter 4. In the spirit of continuity, next week we will look at chapter 5. All right, hey, I want to say hi to Sue Clark. She's watching tonight. Love you, Sue. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Tell Rick and the rest of the family we said hello. Have a good night.